Picture this. It's Christmas Eve, 1895. Snow is falling gently on the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, and behind massive iron gates, something impossible has just been completed. A house. But calling Biltmore a house is like calling the ocean a puddle. 250 rooms. Let that sink in for a moment. To put that in perspective, the White House has 132 rooms. Biltmore had nearly twice as many. We're talking about 178,926 square feet of living space. That's over 4 acres. 4 entire acres under one roof. If you wanted to sleep in a different bedroom every night, you could do so for more than a month without repeating. 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, and this was 1895, when most American homes still had outhouses. The numbers alone tell a story of excess that's hard to fathom. 65 fireplaces, because one simply wasn't enough. 3 kitchens, not 1, not 2, but 3 separate kitchens to prepare meals, an indoor swimming pool, 70,000 gallons of heated water. At a time when most Americans were still bathing in tin tubs, a bowling alley, a gymnasium, a library that could hold 10,000 books. But here's what makes these numbers even more staggering. Biltmore wasn't built in New York City, where such extravagance might make sense among the other Gilded Age mansions. It wasn't built in Newport, Rhode Island, where the wealthy competed to outdo each other with summer cottages. No, this palace was built in the mountains of North Carolina, in what was essentially wilderness. The nearest major city was hours away by train. The construction took 6 years and required more than 1,000 workers. Stonemasons were brought from Europe, Italy, France, England, because American craftsmen simply didn't have the skills needed for what was being attempted. An entire railway had to be built just to transport materials to the construction site. Indiana limestone, millions of pounds of it, was shipped hundreds of miles. Marble from Italy, oak from England, tiles from Spain, and the cost, $6 million in 1895. Today, that would be well over $200 million. For context, you could have built several fully operational colleges for that amount of money. You could have funded entire towns. But one man chose to build a house. When Biltmore was finally completed, it was, and remains to this day, the largest privately owned home in the United States. Not just in 1895, not just during the Gilded Age. In the entire history of this country, no one has ever built a bigger private residence. The robber barons tried. The tech billionaires of today, with their mega yachts and private islands, haven't come close. Biltmore stands alone. But why? Why would anyone build something so impossibly, almost absurdly large? Why in the mountains of North Carolina? And perhaps most intriguingly, how has it survived when almost every other Gilded Age mansion has been demolished, abandoned, or turned over to preservation societies? To answer those questions, we need to understand the man who dreamed it into existence. A man who was nothing like the other Vanderbilts. A man who didn't want to conquer industries or dominate society. A man who wanted something far more elusive, to create beauty that would last forever. George Washington Vanderbilt II was born into American royalty on November 14, 1862. But if you had met him at a society party, you might not have noticed him at all. While his older brothers, Cornelius and William, were making headlines with their business dealings, and their wives were battling for supremacy in New York's ballrooms, George preferred libraries to boardrooms and books to small talk. He was shy, intensely private, and possessed an intellect that his more socially ambitious siblings found peculiar, even embarrassing. His grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, known as the Commodore, had died when George was just 15, leaving behind a fortune of over $100 million, the equivalent of several hundred billion today. It was the largest private fortune in America at the time. The old man had built his empire on steamships and railroads, crushing competitors with ruthless efficiency, accumulating wealth at a pace that shocked even the other robber barons. But George didn't inherit his grandfather's appetite for conquest. While his brothers expanded the family's railroad empire, George did something the Commodore would have considered wasteful. He became educated, truly educated. By the time he was in his 20s, George spoke 8 languages fluently: French, German, Italian, languages he learned not from tutors in parlor rooms, but by actually living in Europe for extended periods. He could read ancient Greek. He studied art history, architecture, agriculture, forestry. His personal library eventually grew to over 23,000 volumes, making it one of the largest private book collections in America. These weren't books bought by the yard to impress visitors. George had read them, annotated them, in multiple languages. In a family of titans, George was an intellectual. In an age when men measured success by the companies they controlled, George measured his life by what he understood, what he had seen, what he had learned. His brothers thought he was wasting his time. Society columnists called him peculiar. But George didn't care. He had money, more money than he could ever spend, and he was determined to spend it on something meaningful. Throughout his 20s, George traveled extensively through Europe, not as a tourist, but as a student of culture and history. He walked through the great châteaux of France's Loire Valley, Chambord, Chenonceau, Blois, studying their architecture, their gardens, their relationship to the landscape. He visited the country estates of English nobility, observing how they managed vast landholdings. He toured the palazzos of Italy, the castles of Germany. And somewhere during these travels, a vision began to form. What if he could create something in America that rivaled the great estates of Europe? Not a copy, but something uniquely American, combining European sophistication with American ambition and innovation. A place of beauty and learning. A self-sustaining estate that would demonstrate modern agricultural and forestry practices. A home that would house his beloved books and art collection. A legacy. By 1888, when George was just 26 years old, he visited Asheville, North Carolina, for the first time. The mountain town was becoming known as a health resort. Its clean air and moderate climate were prescribed by doctors for lung ailments. George's mother, Maria, was in poor health, and the family often visited seeking relief. But George saw something else in those ancient mountains. Standing on a ridge overlooking the French Broad River, with the Blue Ridge Mountains rising in every direction, covered in mist and mystery, George felt something he'd never felt in New York's crowded, competitive society. Peace, possibility, space to create something extraordinary. Most of the land around Asheville had been logged out, farmed to exhaustion, abandoned. It was considered nearly worthless. The forests that had stood for thousands of years had been clear-cut. The soil was depleted. It was, by most accounts, a wasteland. George saw it differently. He saw potential, and he began to buy. Quietly, carefully. Over several years, George assembled his estate. He dealt fairly with local farmers and landowners, paying reasonable prices, something that shocked people who expected a Vanderbilt to simply take what he wanted. Eventually, he owned 125,000 acres. That's nearly 200 square miles, an area larger than many eastern counties. His family thought he'd lost his mind. What was the point of owning massive amounts of exhausted farmland in the middle of nowhere? George's brothers were buying railroads and banks. And here was George, buying dirt in North Carolina. But George knew exactly what he was doing. He hired Gifford Pinchot, a young forester who had studied in Europe, to restore the land. They would replant forests, restore streams, create America's first example of scientific forestry. The land itself would become productive again. And in the middle of this vast estate, on that ridge overlooking the French Broad River, George would build his château. Not a summer cottage like his brothers had in Newport. Not a city mansion like the one his sister-in-law was building on Fifth Avenue. A real home, a year-round residence, a place where he could live surrounded by beauty, nature, and knowledge. He commissioned Richard Morris Hunt, the most prestigious architect in America, the man who had designed the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty, the man who had created the palatial cottages in Newport for the Astors and his own brother. When Hunt asked George what style of house he wanted, George didn't hesitate. French Renaissance château, like the ones he'd studied in the Loire Valley. And he wanted it big enough to house his library, his art collection, and host guests in the manner of the great European estates. Hunt was initially reluctant. The location seemed impossible. Too remote, too mountainous. The scale George envisioned seemed impractical. But George was determined. And George had the resources to make the impossible possible. In 1889, construction began. George was 27 years old, unmarried, with no children. He was building a 250-room house for himself. His books, his dreams. His family whispered that he was eccentric, that he was wasting his fortune, that he would die alone in his mountain palace, surrounded by leather-bound books and empty rooms. They had no idea that what George was creating would outlast every single one of their legacies. That while their mansions would be demolished, sold off, turned into museums, Biltmore would still stand. Still owned by his descendants, still thriving more than a century later. But first, George had to build it, and that would prove to be the challenge of a lifetime. When Richard Morris Hunt stood on that ridge in the North Carolina mountains studying George Vanderbilt's plans, he must have thought his client had either brilliant vision or complete madness. Probably both. Hunt was America's first architect to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And he understood immediately what George wanted. A Loire Valley chateau transplanted whole into the Appalachian wilderness. But this wasn't going to be some romantic American interpretation with a few French flourishes. George wanted authenticity. He wanted the real thing. The design Hunt created was based primarily on 3 French chateaux: Blois, Chenonceau, Chambord. The steeply pitched roof, the ornate dormers, the limestone facade, all pure French Renaissance. But Hunt wasn't just copying, he was adapting, improving, creating something that honored the European tradition while serving American ambitions. The central spine of the house runs 780 feet long. To put that in perspective, that's longer than 2.5 football fields. The limestone facade, quarried from Indiana, required millions of pounds of stone. Each piece was cut, numbered, and transported by rail to Asheville, then up a specially built railway to the construction site. The precision required was extraordinary. These stones had to fit together perfectly, creating walls that would support the massive structure above. But here's what makes Biltmore revolutionary for its time. While it looked medieval on the outside, it was absolutely cutting edge on the inside. George demanded every modern convenience that 1890s technology could provide. Electricity throughout, powered by the estate's own generator. central heating, a steam system that required miles of pipes, hot and cold running water in every bathroom. And remember, there were 43 of them. Mechanical refrigeration in the kitchens, fire alarms, an intercom system connecting the servants' quarters to the main rooms, even elevators, multiple elevators, so guests wouldn't have to climb stairs. The juxtaposition was deliberate. George wanted to live surrounded by old-world beauty, but with new-world comfort. He was a scholar of history, but he wasn't nostalgic for chamber pots and freezing bedrooms. The craftsmanship required for Biltmore's construction was beyond what American workers could provide. Oh, there were skilled craftsmen in America, certainly. But what George envisioned required specialists that simply didn't exist in the United States. So he imported them. Italian stonemasons arrived by the dozens, men who had learned their trade on cathedrals and palazzos. They carved the limestone facade by hand, creating the ornate details that make Biltmore's exterior so breathtaking. French artisans came to create the elaborate plasterwork inside. Ceilings covered in intricate designs that had to be molded, installed, and painted by hand. English woodworkers brought their expertise in carved oak paneling. Spanish tile setters installed floors that would last centuries. These European craftsmen lived on the estate during construction, creating a small international village on the mountainside. They taught American workers their techniques. In many ways, Biltmore became an informal school of old-world craftsmanship in the New World. The construction process was grueling. Remember, this was 1889. No modern construction equipment, no cranes that could lift tons of material with the press of a button. Everything was done with pulleys, scaffolding, brute strength, and meticulous planning. When winter came, work slowed but never stopped. George was impatient to see his vision realized, and the details. God, the details George insisted upon would drive any modern contractor insane. The banquet hall ceiling, 70 feet high, supported by massive steel trusses that had to be disguised as medieval woodwork. The library's carved oak ceiling requiring months of precise carpentry. The stained glass, much of it imported from Europe. Each window designed to fit its specific location. The floor tiles, the doorknobs, the light fixtures. George approved every single choice. His architect Hunt would later say that working with George was both a dream and a nightmare. A dream because George had impeccable taste, unlimited resources, and genuine understanding of architecture. A nightmare because George was never satisfied with good enough. If something wasn't perfect, it was redone. Cost was never the question. Quality was the only question. The landscape was equally important to George. He hired Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect who had designed Central Park in New York. Olmsted was initially skeptical. The land was so degraded, so exhausted from decades of poor farming. But George's vision won him over. They would restore it, transform it, create gardens that would rival anything in Europe. Olmsted designed a 3-mile approach road that would reveal the house gradually, building anticipation. He planned formal gardens near the house, an Italian garden, a walled garden, a shrub garden, each one requiring thousands of plants, many imported from Europe. Further from the house, he designed a working landscape. Farms, forests, nurseries, beauty and utility combined. The whole estate was designed to be self-sufficient. George didn't just want a mansion. He wanted a functioning agricultural estate like the ones he'd studied in Europe. There would be dairy farms producing milk and cheese, orchards and vineyards, vegetable gardens, chicken coops and pig farms. The estate would feed itself and its army of workers. 6 years. That's how long it took to build Biltmore. 6 years of constant construction, constant refinement, constant addition of detail upon detail. The costs mounted steadily. By the time the house was ready for occupancy, George had spent $6 million. And that was just the house itself. Not the land acquisition, not the forestry work, not the farm development. His family was horrified. His brothers, practical men who measured success in profit margins, couldn't understand what George was doing. You could buy entire railroad companies for $6 million. You could fund banks. You could invest in the booming industries that were transforming America. Instead, George was spending it on stone and mortar and carved oak paneling in the middle of nowhere. But George didn't care about their opinions. He never had. While they built empires that would crumble, with market crashes and changing industries, George was building something permanent, something beautiful, something that would matter long after the last railroad spike was pulled from the ground. On December 24th, 1895, Christmas Eve, George opened the doors of Biltmore House for the first time. His family and friends arrived to find something that shouldn't exist. A perfect French château sitting impossibly in the North Carolina mountains. More magnificent than anything they had seen in Newport or New York, or even in Europe itself. They walked through rooms that took their breath away. Imagine you're a guest arriving at Biltmore on that first Christmas Eve in 1895. You've traveled by train from New York, then by carriage up that 3-mile approach road Olmsted designed. Through bare winter trees, you catch glimpses of towers and roof lines. Then suddenly you emerge into the open. And there it is. Massive. Impossible. Beautiful. Your carriage stops at the front entrance. You step out, and before you even enter, you're overwhelmed. The limestone facade rises 4 stories above you. Gargoyles peer down from the roofline. The entrance tower stretches even higher. You're in North Carolina, but you could swear you've been transported to the Loire Valley. Then the doors open, the first room you enter. And remember, this is your first impression of the interior, is the winter garden. Not a parlor, not a formal entrance hall, a garden, indoors, with a glass ceiling allowing natural light to flood in. Palms and ferns and exotic plants create a jungle atmosphere. A fountain bubbles in the center. The floor is covered in intricate tiles. You're inside, but it feels like you're outside. It's disorienting, magical, unlike anything in any American home. But that's just the beginning. From the winter garden, you're led to the banquet hall. And this is where words start to fail. The banquet hall is 70 feet long, 42 feet wide. And the ceiling rises 70 feet above you. 70 feet. That's a 7-story building. In a dining room. The walls are covered in massive Flemish tapestries from the 16th century, each one worth a fortune. A triple fireplace. Yes, triple. 3 fireplaces side by side. Dominates one end of the room, large enough that you could literally stand inside it. The oak table can seat 64 people. 64. For a small dinner party. Above you, the ceiling is a masterpiece of engineering disguised as medieval craftsmanship. Those aren't wooden beams holding up the roof. They're steel trusses covered in wood and plaster to create the illusion of ancient construction. Modern engineering serving aesthetic beauty. That was George's philosophy throughout Biltmore. The flags hanging from the ceiling aren't decorative. They're real battle flags from European regiments, some dating back centuries. George collected them during his travels. Even the light fixtures, enormous wrought iron chandeliers, were custom designed to look medieval while using electric lighting. You could illuminate the entire hall with the flip of a switch. Something most Americans couldn't do in their entire homes. From the banquet hall, you might be led to the library. And if you love books, this is where you'd want to live. The two-story room holds 10,000 volumes from George's personal collection. Floor-to-ceiling shelves in carved walnut, a painted ceiling depicting mythological scenes, comfortable chairs positioned to catch light from the tall windows, a marble fireplace for winter reading. This wasn't a showpiece library with books bought by the yard to impress visitors. These were books George had read, collected over years of travel and study, books in 8 different languages, first editions, rare manuscripts. This was a working library for a genuine scholar. The music room is next, though calling it just a music room doesn't capture it. More tapestries on the walls, a pipe organ built into the architecture, furniture arranged for salon-style entertainment, the kind of intimate musical evenings that European aristocracy had been hosting for centuries. George wanted his home to be a center of culture, and he needed spaces designed for art and music and intellectual conversation. Then there's the breakfast room with Albrecht Dürer prints on the walls and a table set with custom-designed china. The billiard room paneled entirely in Spanish leather, with elaborate carved wood and ceiling paintings. Each room is distinct. Each has its own character, its own treasures. But let's talk about the bathrooms, because this is where Biltmore's modernity really shows. 43 bathrooms in 1895, with hot and cold running water, with porcelain fixtures imported from Europe, with heated towel racks, with tiled walls and floors that would be impressive even today. While most Americans were still using outhouses, George's guests were bathing in luxury that rivaled the finest hotels in Europe. And speaking of modern luxury, the swimming pool, indoors, heated, with underwater lighting, which was absolutely revolutionary technology. The pool room looks like a Roman bath, with elaborate tile work covering every surface. But it's fully functional, filtering and heating 70,000 gallons of water. George's male guests would swim here, and there was a gymnasium adjacent for exercise. This was 1895, before physical fitness was fashionable. But George was ahead of his time. There's a bowling alley in the basement, not just a couple of lanes, a proper bowling alley with custom-made pins and balls. There are rooms dedicated to storing and maintaining hunting equipment, a gun room with hundreds of rifles and shotguns displayed like art, wine cellars designed to hold thousands of bottles at perfect temperature. The servants' quarters, because running a house this size required an army, were better than most American homes of the era. Each servant had their own small room, a luxury when most servants slept in shared quarters. There were servants' dining rooms, sitting rooms, even a servants' laundry with modern washing machines. The kitchens, all 3 of them, were marvels of late 19th century technology. Mechanical refrigeration, gas stoves, hot and cold running water, elaborate storage systems. Everything needed to prepare multi-course meals for dozens of guests, day after day. But here's what strikes you as you wander through these rooms. They're not cold museum spaces. George built Biltmore to be lived in. Yes, it's magnificent. Yes, it's full of priceless art and furniture. But the chairs are comfortable. The fireplaces actually work, and were used daily. The beds are inviting. This wasn't a palace designed to intimidate. It was a home designed to comfort, to inspire, to provide every possible amenity while surrounding you with beauty. Of course, enjoying all this beauty and comfort required something George couldn't build with stone and mortar. People. Lots of people. An entire hidden workforce that made Biltmore function. And that's a story in itself. Behind every fairy tale castle, there's an army of people making the magic happen. At Biltmore, that army numbered around 80 souls at its peak. 80 people whose job was to ensure that George Vanderbilt and his guests never had to think about how a 250-room house actually operated. 80 servants. Let that number settle for a moment. That's more employees than many small businesses had. And these weren't people who showed up for a shift and went home. Most of them lived at Biltmore, in the servants' quarters built into the house. Their entire lives revolved around keeping this enormous estate running smoothly. At the top of this hierarchy was the house steward, essentially the general manager of the entire domestic operation. Below him, a complex web of specialized roles. The butler, who oversaw all male servants and managed the dining room operations. The housekeeper, who commanded all female servants and maintained the cleanliness of every room. These two positions were powerful. They hired and fired. They set schedules. They maintained discipline. In many ways, they ran Biltmore day to day. Then came the specialists, ladies' maids who attended to female guests, ensuring their elaborate dresses were maintained, their hair was styled, their every need anticipated. Valets who served the male guests, laying out clothes, drawing baths, keeping shoes polished to a mirror shine. A head chef and multiple sous chefs working in those 3 kitchens, preparing meals that could include a dozen courses. Kitchen maids who did the actual cleaning, the vegetable preparation, the endless washing up. Footmen served meals, maintained the public rooms, answered doors, delivered messages throughout the house using that intercom system. Housemaids cleaned the bedrooms, made beds, emptied chamber pots before the modern plumbing was fully functional. Dusted furniture, swept floors, maintained fires in dozens of fireplaces. Laundry maids worked in the basement laundry rooms, washing linens by hand. And in a house this size, with guests constantly arriving and departing, the amount of laundry was staggering. Outside, there were gardeners, dozens of them, maintaining those elaborate gardens Olmsted designed. Grooms cared for the horses and carriages. Farm workers managed the dairy operation, the orchards, the vegetable gardens. Foresters worked in the 125,000-acre forest, implementing Gifford Pinchot's revolutionary forestry management techniques. The servants' day began before dawn. The housemaids would be up by 5 in the morning, lighting fires in the bedrooms before the family woke, so they'd rise to warm rooms. The kitchen staff started even earlier, preparing breakfast. By the time George came, downstairs, the house had already been alive with activity for hours. But he'd never see it. That was the point. Good servants were invisible. The servants had their own separate world within Biltmore. They used different staircases, narrow, utilitarian stairs hidden behind walls so they could move throughout the house without being seen. They ate in separate dining rooms, below stairs, though even these rooms were nicer than what most servants experienced elsewhere. George treated his staff well by the standards of the time. They were paid fairly, housed comfortably, fed well, but make no mistake, it was hard work. A housemaid might walk miles through the house each day, climbing stairs, carrying cleaning supplies, maintaining room after room after room. The heat in the kitchens, even with modern ventilation, was brutal. The laundry work was backbreaking. You worked 6 days a week with Sunday afternoons off if you were lucky. Your entire life was structured around the needs of the family and their guests. There was a strict hierarchy and protocol. Servants of higher rank didn't socialize with those of lower rank. Male and female servants were kept largely separated. You didn't speak unless spoken to when the family was present. You didn't make eye contact. You certainly didn't share your opinions or your problems. You were there to serve. And if you did your job well, you were barely noticed. Yet, there was also a strange kind of prestige in working at Biltmore. You were serving one of the wealthiest families in America in one of the most spectacular houses ever built. You learned skills that would serve you throughout your career. The training was rigorous. How to properly serve a 12-course meal. How to maintain priceless antiques. How to operate cutting-edge technology like the electric lighting systems and elevators. A reference from Biltmore's head butler or housekeeper could secure you employment at any great house in America. Some servants spent their entire careers at Biltmore. Decades of service to the Vanderbilt family. They watched George marry, saw his daughter born, mourned when he died. They became part of the estate's story, though their names rarely made it into the history books. The cost of maintaining this staff was enormous. Salaries, food, uniforms, housing, it all added up. This was one of the reasons many Gilded Age estates eventually failed. The families could afford to build these palaces, but maintaining them year after year, decade after decade, proved financially impossible for most. The servant costs alone could bankrupt a lesser fortune. George could afford it, certainly. But even for a Vanderbilt, the expenses were significant. And George was spending money elsewhere, too. On his forestry operations, on his farms, on acquiring art and books, on entertaining guests in the lavish style his house demanded. Biltmore was designed to be self-sufficient through its agricultural operations. But the reality was that the estate consumed money faster than it generated it. Still, for those first years after Biltmore opened, money seemed endless. George hosted elaborate parties and house parties that lasted weeks. The guest lists read like a who's who of Gilded Age society. And every one of those guests marveled at the seamless perfection of their stay, never seeing the army of servants that made it all possible. But George's life as a bachelor in his enormous house wouldn't last forever. When you own the largest, most spectacular house in America, people want to visit. And George Vanderbilt, despite his shy nature, was actually a gracious host. He wanted Biltmore to be a center of culture and learning, and that meant filling those 250 rooms with interesting people. The guest list from Biltmore's early years reads like the social register of Gilded Age America crossed with a literary salon. These weren't just rich people coming to gawk at another rich person's house. George deliberately cultivated relationships with artists, writers, scientists, and political figures. He wanted conversation, intellectual stimulation, cultural exchange. Edith Wharton visited Biltmore multiple times. Yes, that Edith Wharton, the novelist who would win the Pulitzer Prize, who wrote scathingly about Gilded Age excess in books like The Age of Innocence and The House of Mirth. She and George shared a love of literature and European culture. You can imagine them in that magnificent library, discussing the latest novels, debating literary theory. Perhaps Wharton gathering material for her critiques of American nouveau riche society. Though she had to admit, even for someone critical of excess, Biltmore was impressive. It had taste, which many gilded mansions lacked. Henry James, another giant of American literature, also visited. James was famous for his complex novels about Americans encountering European culture. And here was the perfect embodiment of that theme. A European château in American wilderness, owned by an American trying to be more European than the Europeans. The irony wasn't lost on James, but he appreciated what George was attempting. This wasn't crass American showiness. This was genuine cultivation. President Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, Alice Roosevelt, visited as a young woman. Alice was famous for her wild behavior. She smoked cigarettes in public, bet on horse races, kept a pet snake named Emily Spinach. Her father once said, "I can be President of the United States, or I can control Alice. I cannot possibly do both." Alice loved Biltmore. Years later, she'd tell stories about swimming in that indoor pool, about the elaborate dinners, about the sheer audacity of building something so grand in the mountains. John Singer Sargent, arguably the most famous portrait painter of the era, visited and painted at Biltmore. His portraits of Gilded Age society defined how we visualize that era. Having Sargent as a guest wasn't just social prestige. It was artistic validation. George was creating something worthy of being documented by a master. But it wasn't all high culture and serious conversation. George also hosted hunting parties. The estate's 125,000 acres were perfect for it. Wealthy men from New York and beyond would come for weeks at a time, hunting deer, bear, wild turkey. They'd return to Biltmore each evening to elaborate dinners, fine wine from George's cellars, billiards and cigars. The gun room, with its hundreds of rifles displayed like art, wasn't just decorative. Those weapons were used. Christmas was always special at Biltmore. George opened the house on Christmas Eve, 1895, and Christmas celebrations became a tradition. The banquet hall would be decorated with evergreen garlands. A massive Christmas tree, we're talking 20 feet or more, would be erected. Guests would arrive from all over, spending the holiday season in luxury. There would be elaborate meals, musical performances in the music room, perhaps caroling in that indoor winter garden. George wanted to recreate the kind of traditional English country house Christmas he'd experienced in his travels. Dickensian in its warmth and abundance. The servants, of course, worked overtime during these events. But they also got to experience a bit of the magic. George was known for giving generous Christmas bonuses and ensuring his staff had their own celebration. It was practical as much as kind. You needed loyal, happy servants to run an estate this size. And treating them well was simply good management. George also hosted his family. Though these visits were sometimes complicated, his brothers and their wives would come, bringing their competitive social instincts with them. They'd compare notes on who had the finest house, the best art collection, the most impressive guests. George generally won these unspoken competitions, though he seemed less interested in winning than his siblings were. He'd built Biltmore for himself, not to impress them. His mother, Maria Louisa Vanderbilt, visited when her health permitted. She'd been the one constant supporter of George's vision when others in the family thought he was mad. But by the time Biltmore was completed, her health was failing. She died in 1896, just a year after the house opened. George's triumph was shadowed by this loss. The house was partly built for her, a place where she could escape New York's harsh winters, and she barely got to enjoy it. Scientific visitors came too. Remember, this was the era when wealthy Americans were funding museums, universities, research expeditions. George was interested in forestry, agriculture, natural sciences. He'd bring in experts to consult on the estate's operations. These weren't just social visits. They were working consultations. George wanted Biltmore to be a demonstration project, showing that sustainable forestry and modern agriculture could work in the American South. The conversations that happened in Biltmore's rooms during those years, we can only imagine them. Debates about literature, art, politics, science. Stories from European travels. Discussion of the rapidly changing America around them. Industrialization, urbanization, immigration. These were people who had the luxury of thinking about big ideas. And George had created the perfect environment for those discussions. But for all these visitors, for all this entertaining, for all the life that filled Biltmore during those early years, something was missing. George was approaching 40, still unmarried, living alone in this enormous house. His family worried, society gossip speculated, would the shy scholar die a bachelor, leaving no heir to this incredible estate. And then everything changed. George fell in love. Her name was Edith Stuyvesant Dresser. And when George met her in Paris in 1898, she was everything he wasn't. Outgoing where he was, reserved. Socially confident where he was shy. Worldly and sophisticated in ways that came from experience, not just from books. Edith was 32 years old. Her maiden name, Stuyvesant, connected her to one of New York's oldest families, descendants of the last Dutch governor of New Amsterdam. She'd spent years traveling through Europe, moving in the highest social circles, equally comfortable in Paris, London, or Rome. George was 40 years old when they met, and by all accounts, it was genuine love. Not a social arrangement, not a marriage of convenience. For perhaps the first time in his life, the scholarly, introverted George found someone who understood him, who shared his love of culture and beauty, who could navigate the social obligations he found exhausting. They married in Paris in June 1898, a small private ceremony. That was pure George. No massive society wedding, no newspaper coverage, just close family and friends. Then they returned to Biltmore as husband and wife. And suddenly, that enormous house had a purpose beyond being a bachelor's elaborate library. Edith transformed Biltmore. Not physically. The house was already perfect, but socially and practically. George had built a showcase, but he'd never quite figured out how to live in it. Edith knew exactly how to run a great estate. She'd been trained for this her entire life, visiting country houses in England, châteaux in France, villas in Italy. She understood how to manage servants, how to entertain properly, how to make a palace feel like a home. She also understood something George hadn't fully grasped. Biltmore was bleeding money. The construction costs had been staggering. But the operational costs were worse. Those 80 servants, the maintenance of 250 rooms, the elaborate entertaining, the agricultural operations that weren't yet profitable. It all consumed cash at an alarming rate. Even a Vanderbilt fortune wasn't infinite. Edith began making subtle changes, not dramatic cuts that would compromise the estate's magnificence, but careful management that George had neglected. She negotiated better terms with suppliers. She found ways to make the agricultural operations more efficient. She reduced staff slightly, consolidating roles, making the operation leaner without sacrificing service. George had built Biltmore as an artist creates a masterpiece, not considering the practical realities of maintenance. Edith brought practical wisdom to complement his vision. But more than management skills, Edith brought life to Biltmore. Within a year of their marriage, she was pregnant. On August 22, 1900, Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt was born at Biltmore. Finally, those empty nurseries had a purpose. The estate had an heir. George, at 42, was a father. Cornelia's childhood at Biltmore must have been extraordinary. Imagine growing up in the largest house in America with 250 rooms to explore. 125,000 acres as your backyard. She had her own pony, her own teachers, her own suite of rooms. But Edith was determined that Cornelia wouldn't be spoiled by this privilege. She insisted on discipline, on education, on understanding that privilege came with responsibility. For George, these years after his marriage were probably the happiest of his life. He had his beloved home, his library, his forests and gardens. He had a wife who understood him, and a daughter he adored. He continued his scholarly pursuits, his art collecting, his forestry experiments. Biltmore was finally everything he'd dreamed it would be. A family home, not just a palace. But here's the cruel irony of the Gilded Age. You could build something magnificent, but you couldn't build immortality. George's health, never robust, began to fail. He'd always been somewhat frail, preferring books to physical activity. In 1914, he underwent an emergency appendectomy in Washington, D.C. It should have been routine, but complications developed. On March 6, 1914, George Washington Vanderbilt II died on the operating table. He was just 51 years old. He'd had only 16 years in the house he spent 6 years building. 16 years to enjoy what he'd created. He'd been married just 14 years. His daughter Cornelia was only 13. And suddenly, Edith was alone. A widow with a teenage daughter and the largest private home in America to maintain. The estate was still operating at a loss. The agricultural operations, while improved, weren't generating enough income. World War I was beginning in Europe, changing the economic landscape. The Gilded Age was ending, and with it, the era when someone could casually maintain a 250-room house with 80 servants. Edith could have sold Biltmore. Many people expected her to. Other Gilded Age families were already beginning to abandon their massive estates. The costs were simply unsustainable. The Vanderbilt's own mansions in New York were being sold off, demolished. The Newport cottages were being shuttered. The Breakers, the Vanderbilt's most famous Newport house, was becoming a financial burden for its owners. It would have been the practical thing to do. But Edith had loved George, and she understood what Biltmore meant to him. This wasn't just a house. It was his legacy, his statement about what America could be. Beautiful, cultured, sustainable. It was the place where their daughter had been born and raised. And Edith Stuyvesant Dresser Vanderbilt was not a woman who gave up easily. She made a decision that would shock society and save Biltmore. She would fight to keep it, no matter what it took. And what it took would test every ounce of her intelligence, determination, and courage. Because the hardest years were still ahead. The year George died, 1914, was the year the world changed forever. That summer, just months after his death, World War I began in Europe. The old order. The world George had known and loved. The European culture that had inspired Biltmore. All of it was being blown apart by machine guns and artillery. Back in North Carolina, Edith faced her own battles. She was 49 years old, a widow with a 13-year-old daughter, and an estate that was becoming financially unsustainable. The income from George's inheritance was substantial, certainly. But maintaining Biltmore consumed money at a staggering rate. And now, with war in Europe, everything was changing. The first thing Edith did was take complete control. George had managed Biltmore through a combination of passion and delegation, trusting others to handle details. Edith micromanaged. She studied every account book, questioned every expense, demanded efficiency from every operation. The staff, accustomed to George's gentle, scholarly oversight, now answered to a formidable woman who noticed everything. She made hard decisions. The staff was reduced further, not dramatically, but gradually. Some of the less used rooms were closed off, reducing heating and maintenance costs. The entertaining was scaled back. The agricultural operations were expanded and modernized. If Biltmore was going to survive, it needed to generate income, not just consume it. But the bigger challenge was Cornelia, a teenage girl growing up in America's largest house, now without her father, being raised by a mother who was simultaneously grieving and fighting to save their home. Cornelia had been educated at home by tutors, sheltered from the outside world. Now, Edith made another controversial decision. Cornelia would attend school outside Biltmore. She needed to understand the real world, not just the rarefied air of a mountain palace. Cornelia attended school in New York, lived with relatives, experienced life beyond the estate. It was a shock. The girl who'd grown up with servants attending her every need now had to navigate subway cars and busy streets. But Edith was right. Cornelia needed to be prepared for a world that was changing rapidly. When America entered World War I in 1917, even Biltmore couldn't remain isolated. The estate contributed to the war effort, producing food for the military, hosting fundraisers for war bonds. Some of the younger male servants enlisted. The world of the Gilded Age, with its elaborate house parties and leisured society, seemed suddenly frivolous in the face of global war. The 1920s brought new challenges. The war was over. But America was different. The age of the robber barons was truly finished. Income tax, once a minor concern, was rising dramatically. Estate taxes were introduced, making it expensive to pass large fortunes to the next generation. The social world that had celebrated houses like Biltmore now seemed embarrassed by them. This was the Jazz Age. Fast, modern, urban. Mountain estates seemed old-fashioned. Other Vanderbilt properties were being sold. The massive Fifth Avenue mansions in New York demolished to make way for commercial buildings. The Newport cottages, many closed permanently, too expensive to maintain. The Breakers, larger than many European palaces, was becoming a financial burden for its owners. Edith watched this happen and knew Biltmore was next, unless she did something radical. The estate was still operating at a loss. Cornelia was now an adult. She'd married in 1924 in a lavish ceremony at Biltmore and had her own ideas about the estate's future. The pressure was mounting. And then came 1929, the stock market crash, the beginning of the Great Depression. Suddenly, the challenge wasn't just maintaining a large estate. It was survival. Fortunes that had seemed eternal vanished overnight. Banks failed. Businesses collapsed. Even wealthy families found themselves struggling. The Vanderbilt fortune, while still substantial, was not immune. Investments lost value. Income dropped. And Biltmore, with its massive operational costs, became unsustainable in its traditional form. Something had to change, or everything George had built would be lost. Edith was now 64 years old. She'd spent 15 years fighting to keep Biltmore alive. And now she had to make the hardest decision of her life. A decision that would have horrified George. That scandalized what remained of Gilded Age society. But that would ultimately save everything. In 1930, Edith Vanderbilt opened Biltmore House to paying tourists, not as a museum. The family still lived there, but as an attraction. For $2, anyone could tour the ground floor rooms. They could walk through the banquet hall where presidents had dined. They could see the library with its thousands of books. They could glimpse how the other half had lived during the Gilded Age. Society was shocked. Opening your private home to strangers, charging admission. It was unthinkable. It was common. It was commercial. Everything the Vanderbilts had supposedly stood for. Privacy, exclusivity, aristocratic disdain for commerce, was being violated. But Edith didn't care what society thought. She never had. She was saving Biltmore. And if that meant opening the doors to tourists, so be it. George would have understood, she told herself. He'd built Biltmore to be beautiful, to be a model of what American estates could be. Now it would serve a new purpose, showing ordinary Americans the extraordinary, and incredibly, remarkably. It worked. The first tourists who walked through Biltmore's doors in 1930 must have felt like they'd stepped into another world. Remember, this was the Depression. Banks were failing. People were losing their homes. Unemployment was skyrocketing. And here was this palace in the mountains, this remnant of an age when money seemed limitless. Opening its doors for just $2. They came in surprising numbers. Not huge crowds. The Depression limited travel. But enough. People who'd never dreamed they'd see inside a Vanderbilt mansion now walked the same floors where presidents and authors had walked. They stood in that 70-foot-high banquet hall. They gazed at priceless tapestries and artwork. For an hour or two, they could imagine themselves as part of that vanished Gilded Age world. But this wasn't like visiting a museum. The Vanderbilts still lived at Biltmore. Edith and Cornelia had private quarters that tourists didn't access. But they were very much in residence. Sometimes tourists would glimpse them. It must have been strange for both sides. The tourists seeing the wealthy in their natural habitat. The Vanderbilts having strangers walk through their home. The income from tourism helped, but it wasn't enough to fully support the estate. Edith made more difficult decisions. In 1930, she sold a significant portion of the estate's land, about 86,000 acres, to the Jastelbsaubetu federal government. This land became part of Pisgah National Forest, one of the first national forests in the eastern United States. It was fitting in a way. George had pioneered scientific forestry on that land with Gifford Pinchot. Now it would be preserved for the public forever. The sale provided crucial capital that helped Biltmore survive the Depression's worst years. But it also meant the estate was much smaller, down to about 8,000 acres from the original 125,000. The grand vision of a vast, self-sufficient estate was being sacrificed to save the house itself. World War II brought new challenges and opportunities. Biltmore, remote and secure in the mountains, became a safe haven for priceless art. The National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., fearing bomb attacks on the Capitol, sent many of its most valuable pieces to Biltmore for storage. Paintings worth millions, masterworks that today would be priceless, were crated up and stored in Biltmore's music room and other spaces. For several years during the war, Biltmore housed more important art than almost any museum in the world. Tourism during the war years was limited. Gasoline was rationed and people had other concerns. But Edith, now in her 70s, continued managing the estate with the same determination she'd shown for decades. She'd saved Biltmore through the Depression. She'd navigate through the war. Cornelia's life took a different turn. Her marriage fell apart in the 1930s. She divorced and eventually moved away from Biltmore, spending time in Europe and New York. The daughter born into such privilege found that privilege confining. She wanted her own life, free from the responsibility of maintaining her father's legacy. It was Edith, the widow who'd married into the family, who carried that burden. Edith died in 1958 at the age of 92. She'd outlived George by 44 years. She'd spent nearly half a century fighting to preserve what he'd built. When she died, Biltmore was still standing, still owned by the family, still operating, against all odds, against every economic disaster and social change that had destroyed other Gilded Age estates. Biltmore had survived. But survival came at a cost. The estate was smaller. It was open to tourists. The family no longer lived there full-time in the old way. It had become as much a business as a home. The world of servants and endless entertaining was gone. The Gilded Age was truly over. Yet Edith had accomplished something remarkable. While the Vanderbilt mansions in New York were demolished, while the Newport cottages became museums or hotels, while the other great American estates crumbled or were sold off. Biltmore remained in family hands, damaged, diminished, but alive. The question now was, could the next generation do what Edith had done? Could they adapt again to a changing America? Because by the 1960s and 70s, maintaining even a reduced Biltmore was becoming increasingly difficult. Estate taxes, property taxes, maintenance costs, they never stopped. The tourism income helped. But was it enough? George's grandson, William Amherst Vanderbilt Cecil, took over management of Biltmore after Edith's death. He faced a choice that previous generations hadn't. Should the family finally give up and sell? Or could Biltmore evolve once more, finding a way to survive in modern America? What happened next would determine whether George's vision would survive into the 21st century, or whether Biltmore would finally join the other Gilded Age mansions in history's graveyard. Stand at Biltmore's entrance today, and you'll see something that shouldn't exist. A fully operational, family-owned Gilded Age estate, 130 years after it was built. By all logic, by all historical precedent, this shouldn't be possible. Consider what happened to the other great American estates. The Vanderbilts owned Fifth Avenue mansions in New York, demolished in the 1920s and 30s, replaced by commercial buildings. The Breakers in Newport, larger and more elaborate than many European palaces, given to the Preservation Society in 1972 because the family couldn't afford to maintain it. The Marble House, also in Newport, became a museum. Whitehall, Henry Flagler's mansion in Florida, a museum. The list goes on. Demolished, donated, sold, converted. But Biltmore is still owned by George Vanderbilt's descendants, still operated as a family business, still, in many ways, serving as a private home, though one that welcomes over 1 million visitors each year. How is this possible? The answer is adaptation. Constant, creative, sometimes painful adaptation to changing times. William Cecil, George's grandson, who took over in the 1960s, understood that tourism alone wasn't enough. The estate needed multiple revenue streams to survive. So he expanded, carefully, thoughtfully. A winery was established on the estate grounds. Today, Biltmore Estate Winery is one of the most visited wineries in America. Producing award-winning wines using traditional methods George would have appreciated. A luxury hotel was built on the estate, not in the house itself, but on the grounds. The inn on Biltmore Estate offers guests a chance to stay on the property, to wake up to those mountain views George first saw in 1888. It's 5-star luxury that generates significant income while preserving the house's integrity. Restaurants were added, gift shops, special events, concerts, Christmas celebrations, spring blooms in the gardens. Biltmore became a destination, not just a house tour. People come for weddings, for corporate events, for wine tastings, for outdoor adventures on the remaining 8,000 acres. The house itself has been meticulously preserved, and in many ways restored beyond its original glory. Modern climate control protects the art and furnishings. Fire suppression systems protect against disaster. The maintenance staff, still substantial though nothing like the 80 servants of George's day, works year-round to preserve every detail. The rooms tourists see today look much as they did in 1895. The banquet hall still takes your breath away. The library still holds thousands of books, many from George's original collection. The winter garden still blooms with exotic plants. The indoor pool, the bowling alley, the bedrooms, carefully maintained, preserved as monuments to Gilded Age craftsmanship. But here's what makes Biltmore truly special in the modern era. It's not frozen in time. The family continues to live on the estate, in private quarters. The current generation of Vanderbilt descendants, George's great-great-grandchildren, are involved in the estate's operation. This isn't a museum run by a board of directors. It's a family business, passed down through generations, with all the complications and commitments that entails. The economic model is complex but successful. Tourism is the primary revenue source. Those million-plus annual visitors pay admission that covers much of the operational costs. The winery is highly profitable. The hotel and restaurants generate income. Corporate events and weddings bring in substantial fees. Together, these diverse revenue streams do what seemed impossible. They make Biltmore financially sustainable. The estate still faces challenges. Property taxes on 8,000 acres and a priceless house are substantial. Maintenance never ends. A house this old, this large, constantly needs work. Labor costs, insurance, utilities, all the mundane expenses of operating what's essentially a small town. Estate taxes remain a threat with each generation. The family has to plan decades in advance to ensure the estate can pass to the next generation without being sold to pay taxes. Yet they've managed. Through depression and war. Through social changes that made Gilded Age estates seem obscene. Through tax policies designed to break up large estates. Through economic recessions and changing tourist patterns. Biltmore has survived, when nothing else like it has. What would George think if he could see Biltmore today? He'd surely be shocked by the tourists walking through his home. He built it as a private retreat, and now strangers photograph every room. He'd probably be amazed that people care, that Americans want to see what he created. But he'd also recognize his vision. The house is beautiful, maintained to the highest standards. The forests he worked to restore still stand. The estate still demonstrates that you can combine beauty with sustainability. His library, his art collection, his dream of creating something lasting, it's all still here. And perhaps most importantly, Biltmore still inspires. Those million annual visitors don't just come to gawk at wealth. They come to see what's possible when someone has a vision and the means to realize it. They come to see craftsmanship that doesn't exist anymore. They come to walk through a piece of history that's somehow still alive. Biltmore stands today as something unique in American history. A Gilded Age estate that survived the age that created it. Not perfectly, not unchanged, but survived, adapted, thrived. It's a monument to George's vision, yes, but it's equally a monument to Edith's determination, to William Cecil's business acumen, to every generation that chose to preserve rather than profit. The biggest mansion the Gilded Age ever built became something George never intended. A symbol of American preservation, of sustainability, of family legacy. It survived because each generation was willing to change everything except the core vision, to maintain beauty, to preserve craftsmanship, to show that some things are worth fighting for. As you stand at Biltmore today, looking up at that French château, impossibly situated in the North Carolina mountains, you're not just seeing a house, you're seeing proof that with vision, determination, and constant adaptation, even the most improbable dreams can survive. George built Biltmore to last. Against all odds, it has. And if the family continues their stewardship, it will stand for generations more. America's greatest mansion, still owned by the family that built it, still inspiring everyone who walks through its doors.